Sarah Mitchell had always believed that life would unfold according to plan. At 28, she had mapped out her future with the precision of an architect drawing blueprints. A successful career as a social worker in Portland, a cozy apartment overlooking the river, and eventually a family of her own. But life, as she was learning, rarely follows the neat lines we draw for it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a courier who seemed as surprised as Sarah to be making a delivery to the remote Klamath County office where she worked. The envelope bore the official seal of the Oregon Department of Human Services, and inside was an assignment that would change everything she thought she knew about herself and her purpose. Immediate placement required, the letter read. Social worker needed for emergency case involving Native American children in the Modoc community. Temporary housing will be provided. Duration, indefinite. Sarah stared at the words, her coffee growing cold in her hands. She had requested field work, yes, but she had imagined something closer to civilization. The Modoc Reservation was hours away from Portland, nestled in the high desert country where cell phone towers were scarce, and the nearest grocery store was a 40-minute drive on winding mountain roads. Her supervisor, Helen, knocked on the door frame. "I know it's not what you expected," she said, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "But the situation is critical. We've had 3 families in crisis and the local resources are stretched thin. You have the most experience with trauma cases." Sarah looked at the files Helen placed before her. Photos of children with dark eyes and serious expressions stared back at her. She read their stories. Families struggling with poverty, substance abuse, domestic violence. Problems that seemed insurmountable even with the best resources, let alone in a community that felt forgotten by the outside world. "How long?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer would be vague. "As long as it takes," Helen replied. "Maybe 6 months. Maybe longer." The tribal council specifically requested someone who could stay long enough to build real relationships, not just process paperwork and leave. That evening, Sarah packed her life into boxes and suitcases. Her friends thought she was crazy. Jessica, her college roommate, helped her load the car while expressing her doubts. "You're giving up everything for what? To live in the middle of nowhere with no internet and no social life?" But Sarah felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. A sense of purpose that went beyond routine case files and bureaucratic procedures. Maybe it was the adventure she had been unconsciously craving. Or maybe it was the photos of those children that haunted her thoughts. The drive to the reservation took her through landscapes that shifted from green valleys to high desert, from bustling towns to empty stretches of road where she didn't see another car for miles. As the elevation climbed, her ears popped, and she found herself in a world of sagebrush and volcanic rock, where the sky seemed impossibly vast and the silence was complete. The temporary housing turned out to be a small trailer on the edge of the reservation, provided by the tribal council. It was basic but clean, with a tiny kitchen, a living area barely big enough for a couch, and a bedroom that could fit little more than a bed. The windows looked out over rolling hills covered in native grass, and in the distance she could see the modest homes that made up the heart of the community. Her first week was overwhelming. The poverty was more crushing than anything she had encountered in her Portland cases. Families lived in houses with broken windows patched with cardboard, where the electricity was sometimes shut off for non-payment, where children went to school hungry because there wasn't enough food at home. But what struck her most was the resilience of the people she met, the way they cared for each other, shared what little they had, and maintained their dignity despite circumstances that would have broken many others. The tribal council consisted of 5 elders who welcomed her with cautious politeness. They had seen social workers come and go, promising change and delivering disappointment. Sarah understood their skepticism and knew she would have to prove herself through actions, not words. "We've been let down before," explained Robert Crowfeather, the council chairman, during their first meeting. "People come here with good intentions, but they don't understand our ways. They see problems but not strengths. They see deficits but not assets." Sarah listened carefully, taking notes not just on the official business but on the subtle lessons about respect and cultural sensitivity that were being offered. She was beginning to understand that her success here would depend not just on her professional skills but on her ability to learn and adapt to a way of life completely different from her own. The end of her second week, she was exhausted. The emotional weight of the cases, combined with the isolation and the constant feeling of being an outsider, began to wear on her. She called Helen one evening, standing outside her trailer where she could get a weak cell phone signal. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," she admitted. "These families need so much more than I can give them. The problems run so deep, and the resources are so limited." Helen's voice crackled through the poor connection. "Give it time, Sarah. You're not there to fix everything. You're there to help where you can and to learn what you can't fix." That night, Sarah sat on the small steps of her trailer, looking up at a sky filled with more stars than she had ever seen in the city. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant call of a coyote and the whisper of wind through the sagebrush. For the first time since arriving, she felt a moment of peace, though she couldn't yet imagine that this harsh, beautiful landscape would soon become more than just a temporary assignment. It would become home in ways she never expected. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah thought about the children in the photos on her desk, wondering if she would be able to make any real difference in their lives. She had no way of knowing that one of those children would soon change her life in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. 3 months into her assignment, Sarah had fallen into a rhythm of sorts, though it was unlike any routine she had known in Portland. Her days began before sunrise with the sound of horses whinnying in the distance and the soft murmur of Modoc being spoken by early risers tending to their morning chores. She had learned to appreciate the strong coffee that seemed to be a universal language among the reservation residents, and she had grown accustomed to the long drives between scattered homes on dirt roads that turned to mud whenever it rained. The cases she managed were complex and heartbreaking. There was Maria Santos, a young mother struggling with depression after her husband's death in a logging accident, trying to raise 3 children on a widow's pension that barely covered rent. There was Tommy Whitehorse, a teenager whose anger at the world manifested in petty crimes that were escalating toward more serious trouble. And there was the Johnson family, where alcoholism had created a cycle of neglect that affected 4 generations living under one roof. But it was the Walker family that kept Sarah awake at night, wrestling with decisions that seemed to have no good answers. Joseph Walker was a single father raising his 8-year-old son, Daniel, after his wife had left the reservation 2 years earlier. Joseph worked construction when he could find it, but jobs were scarce, especially for someone who had struggled with addiction in the past. Though he had been clean for over a year, his history made him a constant target of suspicion from authorities. The complaint that brought Sarah to their door came from a concerned teacher who noticed that Daniel often came to school without lunch and sometimes fell asleep in class. When Sarah made her first visit to their small house on the outskirts of the community, she found a home that was poor but clean, a father who was trying his best with limited resources, and a child who was clearly loved, but struggling with the instability of their situation. Joseph Walker was a man in his early 30s with calloused hands and tired eyes that seemed much older than his years. He stood well over 6 feet tall with traditional Modoc features and long black hair that he usually kept tied back while working. There was a quiet dignity about him that Sarah noticed immediately, along with a wariness that she had learned to expect from parents who had been scrutinized by social services. "I know why you're here," he said when Sarah introduced herself. "Someone thinks I'm not taking care of my boy properly." Sarah had learned to be direct in her conversations with reservation families. The bureaucratic language that worked in Portland often came across as condescending here. "The school is concerned about Daniel. They want to make sure he has what he needs." Joseph's jaw tightened, but he invited her inside. The house was small but organized. Sarah noticed handmade furniture that showed real craftsmanship, a dining table with intricate carvings, shelves that had been carefully sanded and stained. In one corner sat a beautiful wooden bow, clearly intended for a child with arrows that had been fletched by hand. "I made that for Daniel," Joseph said, noticing her gaze, "teaching him the old ways. My grandfather taught me when I was his age." Daniel emerged from what appeared to be his bedroom, a shy boy with his father's dark eyes and a reserved manner that seemed unusual for an 8-year-old. He stayed close to his father, watching Sarah with curiosity but maintaining a respectful distance. Over the next several visits, Sarah began to understand the complexity of the Walker family situation. Joseph was indeed struggling financially, but he was also providing his son with something that couldn't be measured in material terms: a connection to their cultural heritage, a sense of identity and unconditional love. Daniel could recite Modoc creation stories, knew the names of plants and their traditional uses, and was learning skills that had been passed down through generations. But the reality remained that there were times when there wasn't enough food in the house, when the electricity was shut off for non-payment, when Joseph had to choose between buying Daniel new shoes and keeping gas in the truck he needed for work. Sarah found herself caught between her duty to ensure Daniel's immediate welfare and her growing understanding that removing him from his father's care might cause more harm than good. The situation came to a head on a particularly difficult Tuesday in June. Sarah had received a call from the school reporting that Daniel had fainted during recess, apparently from hunger. When she arrived at the Walker house that afternoon, she found Joseph sitting at his handmade table with his head in his hands. "The construction job ended yesterday," he said, without looking up. "They said they'd call me for the next project, but that could be weeks away. I've got maybe $30 to last until then." Sarah sat across from him, feeling the weight of the decision she knew she might have to make. According to protocol, a child who was not receiving adequate nutrition should be placed in emergency foster care. But she also knew that there were no available Modoc foster families, which meant Daniel would be placed with a non-native family off the reservation, potentially hundreds of miles away. "There might be other options," Sarah said carefully. "The tribal council has emergency assistance programs. There's a food bank in Klamath Falls. We could look into temporary help while you find work." Joseph finally looked up, and Sarah saw something in his expression that broke her heart. Not just desperation, but shame. Here was a man who had been taught that providing for his family was fundamental to his identity as a father, and circumstances beyond his control were making that impossible. "I don't want charity," he said quietly. "I want to take care of my son myself." "Accepting help isn't giving up," Sarah replied. "It's being smart enough to use all available resources to keep your family together." That evening, Sarah drove to the tribal council office and spent hours researching programs and possibilities. She made phone calls to organizations she had never heard of, looking for any resource that might help the Walker family bridge the gap until Joseph could find steady work again. As she worked, she found herself thinking not just about Daniel's immediate needs, but about the larger injustices that created situations like this. Families on the reservation faced challenges that went far beyond individual circumstances. Historical trauma, limited economic opportunities, geographic isolation from services. She was beginning to understand that her role here was not just about managing cases, but about advocating for systemic changes. When she finally locked up the office and walked to her car, Sarah realized that somewhere along the way, her feelings about this assignment had shifted. What had started as a temporary placement had become something much more personal. She cared about these families in a way that went beyond professional obligation, and the thought of leaving them to return to Portland was becoming increasingly difficult to imagine. By late summer, Sarah had managed to help Joseph Walker find a more stable situation. Through her persistent advocacy, she had connected him with a tribal employment program that provided job training and placement assistance. Joseph was now working with a construction crew that specialized in building homes on the reservation, a job that not only provided steady income, but also allowed him to remain close to his community and his son. Daniel had blossomed over the past few months. With regular meals and the security of knowing his father had steady work, the quiet, withdrawn child had begun to show his true personality. He was bright and curious, with a dry sense of humor that reminded Sarah of his father. He excelled in school and had become something of a leader among his peers, organizing games during recess and helping younger children with their schoolwork. Sarah had also discovered that Daniel had inherited his father's artistic abilities. The boy could carve intricate designs in wood with a skill that amazed adults, and his drawings showed an eye for detail that was remarkable for his age. Joseph had been teaching him traditional Modoc crafts, and their home was now filled with beautiful objects that father and son had created together. But it was Daniel's growing comfort with Sarah that surprised her most. Initially, he had been polite but distant, answering her questions with careful monosyllables. Now he would run to greet her when she visited, eager to show her his latest school project or a new carving he had completed. He had begun calling her by her first name instead of the formal Miss Mitchell, and he would sometimes forget himself and chatter away about his day as if she were a family friend rather than a social worker. Joseph's relationship with Sarah had evolved as well. The wariness and suspicion had gradually given way to respect and trust. He had begun seeking her advice on matters that went beyond their official case, asking her opinion about Daniel's education, or sharing concerns about challenges facing the broader community. Sarah found herself looking forward to these conversations, which often extended far beyond the scope of her professional duties. One evening in early September, Sarah was working late in her office when Joseph knocked on the door. This was unusual, as he typically preferred to meet during regular business hours and always at his home rather than the tribal offices. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, hat in hand. "I wanted to talk to you about something." Sarah invited him in, noting that he seemed more nervous than she had ever seen him. He sat across from her desk but didn't speak immediately, instead studying his hands as if trying to find the right words. "The tribal council is meeting next week," he finally said. "They're going to be discussing the social services contract, whether to renew it or look for someone new." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had known this moment would come eventually, but somehow she had begun to think of her position here as permanent, despite the temporary nature of her original assignment. "I see," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Have they made a decision?" Joseph looked up and Sarah was surprised to see genuine concern in his expression. "They're divided. Some think you've done good work, helped families in ways that other social workers haven't. But others worry about keeping an outsider long term. They think maybe it's time to find someone from the community." Sarah nodded, understanding the logic even as her heart sank. "That makes sense. Someone from the community would have insights I'll never have, no matter how long I stay." "That's not what I wanted to talk to you about," Joseph said quietly. "I wanted to talk to you about Daniel." He paused, seeming to gather courage for whatever he was about to say. "He's gotten attached to you, more than I realized at first. Yesterday he asked me what would happen to you when your job here ends. When I told him you'd probably go back to Portland, he got upset. Really upset." Sarah felt a pang of guilt. She'd grown so comfortable with Daniel, had enjoyed their easy friendship so much that she hadn't considered how her eventual departure might affect him. Children in his situation had already experienced abandonment and loss. The last thing she wanted was to add to that pain. "I should have been more careful," she said. "I didn't want him to feel abandoned again." Joseph shook his head. "That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that he cares about you, and I think you care about him too. About us." Sarah met his gaze and saw something there that made her breath catch. This conversation was heading somewhere she hadn't expected, touching on feelings she had been careful not to examine too closely. "Of course I care," she said. "I care about all the families I work with." "But this is different," Joseph said. "Isn't it?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah knew he was right. Somewhere along the way, her feelings for the Walker family had moved beyond professional concern. She looked forward to her visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with case management. She found herself thinking about Daniel's progress during her off hours, worrying about Joseph's job situation, even when there was nothing more she could do to help. She had begun to think of their small house as a place where she was welcome, not just as a social worker, but as something approaching family. "Yes," she admitted quietly, "it is different." Joseph nodded as if this confirmed something he had already known. "Daniel asked me something else yesterday, something that made me realize how much our lives have changed since you came here." Sarah waited, sensing that whatever Daniel had asked was important enough to bring Joseph to her office on a September evening. "He asked me if you were going to be his new mother," Joseph said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He said that in the stories I tell him when someone comes to help a family and makes everything better, sometimes they stay and become part of the family." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "Joseph, I never meant to give him that impression. I would never presume. I told him that grown-ups don't make decisions like that as easily as they do in stories." Joseph interrupted. "But then I started thinking about it myself, about what it would mean if you did stay, not just for your job, but really stay, become part of our community, part of our family." The words settled between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that Sarah could feel but couldn't yet understand. She realized that Joseph was not just sharing his son's innocent question, but exploring the possibility himself. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. "I don't know what to say," Sarah said honestly. "You don't have to say anything tonight," Joseph replied, standing to leave. "I just wanted you to know that if you ever wanted to stay, really stay, there would be people here who would welcome that. Daniel and we'd welcome that." After he left, Sarah sat in her office for a long time, staring out the window at the vast sky that was just beginning to show its first stars. For the first time since arriving on the reservation, she allowed herself to imagine a life that extended beyond her temporary assignment. A future that was rooted in this place and these people who had somehow become so important to her. The tribal council meeting took place on a crisp October morning in the community center, a building that served multiple purposes for the reservation. Sarah had been invited to attend, both to give a report on her work and to hear the council's decision about her future role. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing clothes that were professional but not formal, wanting to show respect for the proceedings without appearing to put on airs. The 5 council members sat at a long table facing rows of folding chairs where community members had gathered. Sarah recognized many faces in the audience, parents of children she had worked with, elders she had met during her months on the reservation, tribal employees who had become colleagues and friends. Joseph sat in the back row with Daniel beside him, both dressed in their best clothes for the occasion. Chairman Crow Feather called the meeting to order and began with a traditional blessing in Modoc before switching to English. The first hour was devoted to routine tribal business, budget discussions, maintenance issues, upcoming cultural events. Sarah listened respectfully, understanding that this was how important decisions were made here, with careful attention to all aspects of community life. When her name was finally called, Sarah walked to the front of the room with hands that trembled slightly. She had prepared remarks, but as she looked out at the faces of people who had become so important to her, she decided to speak from her heart instead. "6 months ago I came here as a stranger," she began. "I thought I understood what this job would involve, but I was wrong. I thought I would be helping your families solve their problems and then returning to my old life. I didn't expect to be changed by this experience in ways I'm still trying to understand." She paused, making eye contact with Joseph and Daniel before continuing. "I've learned that effective social work isn't about imposing outside solutions on your community. It's about understanding your strengths, respecting your traditions, and finding ways to support families that honor who you are as a people. I've learned more in these 6 months than in all my previous years of professional training." Sarah went on to describe specific cases she had handled, being careful not to violate confidentiality, while illustrating the collaborative approach she had developed. She talked about connecting families with resources, advocating for policy changes that better served the reservation's unique needs, and working with tribal leaders to strengthen existing support systems. "If you choose to renew my contract," she concluded, "I would be honored to continue this work. But I understand if you decide that your community would be better served by someone who was born here, who understands your culture from the inside in ways I never will." The questions that followed were thoughtful and challenging. Council member Patricia Strongbear asked about Sarah's long-term commitment to the community. "Social workers come and go," she said. "How do we know you won't leave when something better comes along?" It was a fair question, and one Sarah had been wrestling with herself. "I can't make promises about the future that I might not be able to keep," she answered honestly. "What I can tell you is that this community has become home to me in ways I never expected. The work here feels more meaningful than anything I've done before. If you'll have me, I'd like to make this my permanent home." Elder Thomas Redwing asked about her understanding of Modoc traditions and how they influenced her approach to family services. Sarah acknowledged her ongoing learning process and described how community members had taught her to see strengths, where she might previously have focused only on deficits, the most difficult. Question came from Council Member Maria Smokejumper, who asked directly whether Sarah's personal relationships in the community might compromise her professional judgment. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized the council was aware of her growing closeness to the Walker family. "Personal connections always influence professional work," Sarah said carefully, "but I believe they make me more effective, not less. When you care about people as individuals rather than just as cases, you work harder to find solutions that truly help. I've been careful to maintain professional boundaries while building the trust relationships that make this work possible." After the formal questioning, Chairman Crowfeather dismissed Sarah so the council could deliberate privately. She waited in the parking lot, too nervous to go far from the building but too anxious to sit still. Other community members filed past, some offering encouraging words, others simply nodding respectfully. Joseph found her there, pacing between cars. "How do you think it went?" he asked. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I think I was honest, maybe too honest. When they asked about personal relationships," she trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. "Everyone knows we've become friends," Joseph said. "There's no shame in that. People here value relationships. They want to know that you care about us as people, not just as work." Daniel ran up to them, having been released from the burden of sitting quietly through the long meeting. "Are you going to stay?" he asked Sarah directly. "Are you going to keep being our social worker?" "I hope so," Sarah said, kneeling to his level. "But that's up to the council to decide." "I heard Mrs. Smokejumper ask if you liked my dad too much to do your job right," Daniel said with the startling directness of children. "That's silly. You do your job better because you like us." Joseph and Sarah exchanged glances over Daniel's head. The boy's innocent observation cut straight to the heart of the matter in a way that all the careful diplomatic language couldn't. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes, the council called everyone back inside. Chairman Crowfeather stood at the front of the room, his expression giving nothing away. "The council has reached a decision regarding the social services contract," he announced. "We have been impressed with the work that Ms. Mitchell has done during her temporary assignment. She has shown respect for our community and our ways while bringing skills and resources that have genuinely helped our families." Sarah held her breath, trying to read between the formal words. "However," the chairman continued, "we have concerns about the sustainability of depending on outside personnel for essential services. We believe our community would be best served by developing our own capacity to provide these services." Sarah's heart sank. She understood the reasoning, even agreed with it. But the disappointment was crushing. "Therefore," Chairman Crowfeather said, "we are offering Ms. Mitchell a permanent position, contingent on her commitment to remain in the community for a minimum of 3 years and her willingness to train local community members to eventually take over some of these responsibilities." It took a moment for the words to sink in. Sarah looked around the room, seeing smiles on faces that had been carefully neutral moments before. In the back row, Daniel was practically bouncing in his seat while Joseph's face showed relief and something that looked very much like joy. "Furthermore," the chairman continued, "we are recommending that the Tribal Housing Authority make available one of the permanent staff residences so that Ms. Mitchell can move out of the temporary trailer and establish a real home in our community." The formal meeting dissolved into congratulations and discussions of practical details. Sarah found herself surrounded by people who were no longer clients or colleagues but neighbors and friends. As the crowd began to thin, Joseph approached with Daniel at his side. "Congratulations," he said simply. "I'm glad you're staying." "Me too," Sarah replied and realized she meant it completely. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them as a permanent member of this community that had somehow become home. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the high desert and snow that transformed the landscape into something ethereal and beautiful. Sarah had moved into her permanent residence, a small but comfortable house that the Tribal Housing Authority had renovated specifically for her use. For the first time since arriving on the reservation, she felt truly settled. With her own furniture arranged around a wood-burning stove and windows that looked out over snow-covered hills. Her work had evolved significantly since the council's decision to make her position permanent. She was now training 2 young tribal members, recent college graduates who had returned to the reservation with degrees in social work and psychology. Jennifer Brokenhorn and Marcus Stands Tall brought perspectives that complemented Sarah's skills perfectly. They understood the cultural context in ways she was still learning, while she provided experience with systems navigation and crisis intervention. The training process had been enlightening for all of them. Sarah found herself articulating approaches she had developed intuitively, while Jennifer and Marcus challenged her assumptions and suggested modifications that made their interventions more culturally appropriate. Together, they were developing a model of social services that honored traditional Modoc values, while meeting contemporary legal and professional standards. But it was her evolving relationship with the Walker family that occupied Sarah's thoughts, most often during the quiet winter evenings. What had begun as a professional relationship had deepened into genuine friendship, and lately, something that felt like it might be moving beyond friendship. Joseph had begun inviting her for dinner regularly, not for case-related discussions, but simply for the pleasure of her company. Daniel had taken to doing his homework at her kitchen table, claiming that her house was quieter than his own, though Sarah suspected he simply enjoyed having her help with his mathematics and science projects. The three of them had fallen into comfortable routines that felt remarkably like family life. Joseph would often stop by her house on his way home from work, sometimes bringing groceries that they would cook together while Daniel entertained them with stories from school. Sarah had learned to make traditional Modoc foods under Joseph's patient instruction, while he had developed a taste for the Italian dishes she remembered from her grandmother's kitchen. On weekends, they would often take long walks through the snowy landscape, with Joseph teaching Sarah and Daniel about the winter survival skills his ancestors had used for generations. Daniel had become an accomplished tracker, able to identify animal prints in the snow and predict weather changes by observing cloud formations. Sarah marveled at the depth of knowledge that was being passed down through these informal lessons, understanding that she was witnessing something precious and irreplaceable. It was during one of these winter walks that Daniel asked the question that would change everything. They had stopped to rest on a fallen log, sharing hot chocolate from a thermos while watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. The conversation had been relaxed and wandering, touching on school subjects, plans for spring planting, and Daniel's latest carving project. "Sarah," Daniel said suddenly, his voice carrying the serious tone he used when asking important questions. "Do you think you'll ever get married?" Sarah nearly choked on her hot chocolate. "That's a very personal question, Daniel. Why do you ask?" "Because I was thinking," Daniel continued with the relentless logic of children, "that you and my dad should get married. Then you could be my real mom, not just my friend who helps with homework." Joseph's face had gone completely still, and Sarah could feel her own cheeks burning despite the cold air. "Daniel," Joseph said quietly, "that's not something you can just decide for other people." "But why not?" Daniel persisted. "You like each other. Sarah makes you smile more than you used to, and she's already like family anyway. She helps take care of us and we help take care of her. Isn't that what families do?" Sarah found herself struggling for words. Daniel's innocent question had touched on feelings she had been carefully avoiding, emotions that had been growing stronger despite her attempts to maintain appropriate boundaries. The truth was that she had begun to think of Joseph and Daniel as her family, and the idea of making that official was both appealing and terrifying. "Marriage is complicated, sweetie," Sarah finally managed. "It's not just about liking someone or even loving them. There are lots of things adults have to consider." "Like what?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious. Joseph intervened before Sarah had to answer. "Like whether two people want the same things for their future. Like whether they're ready to make promises to take care of each other for their whole lives. Like whether they both feel ready for that kind of commitment." But Daniel wasn't easily discouraged. "Don't you want the same things? You both want to take care of me. You both want to live here. You both like the same movies and the same food. And Dad taught you to make fry bread, which means he really likes you because Grandma said he only teaches special people family recipes." Sarah looked at Joseph, seeing her own confusion and longing reflected in his expression. The conversation was moving into territory that perhaps they should have explored privately, before Daniel forced them to confront it so directly. "These are grown-up conversations," Joseph said gently but firmly. "Sarah and I will talk about grown-up things when we're ready. Right now, let's focus on enjoying our walk and getting home before the snow starts again." Daniel seemed to accept this deflection, but Sarah could see the wheels turning in his young mind. He had planted a seed with his innocent question, and she suspected he wouldn't let the matter rest easily. The walk home was quieter than usual, each of them lost in their own thoughts. When they reached Sarah's house, Joseph hesitated at the door. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" Sarah asked, the usual invitation feeling weighted with new meaning. "Daniel should get home for his bath," Joseph said. "But maybe later after he's in bed we could talk?" Sarah nodded, understanding that the conversation Daniel had started needed to be finished properly, between the adults involved. That evening, after Daniel had been tucked into bed with a story and promises that they would continue their winter nature lessons the next weekend, Joseph returned to Sarah's house. They sat in her living room with mugs of coffee, the wood stove crackling softly between them. "I'm sorry about this afternoon," Joseph began. "Daniel doesn't always think before he speaks." "He's 8 years old," Sarah said. "He's supposed to say what he's thinking. The question is whether he's the only one thinking it." Joseph looked up from his coffee, meeting her gaze directly. "What do you mean?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she said next would change their relationship irrevocably one way or another. "I mean that maybe he's not wrong. Maybe we have been acting like a family. Maybe we do care about each other in ways that go beyond friendship. Maybe it's time we admitted that to ourselves." The silence that followed was charged with possibility and fear. Joseph set down his coffee mug and was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the flames dancing in the wood stove. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and measured. "I've been thinking about what Daniel said too," he admitted. "But there's a lot at stake here, Sarah. Not just for us, but for him. If we try this and it doesn't work out, he's the one who gets hurt. He's already lost his mother. I can't put him through losing someone else he cares about." Sarah felt her heart ache at the pain in Joseph's voice. She understood his caution. It came from a place of fierce protectiveness for his son. But she also felt a certainty that surprised her with its strength. "What if it does work out?" she asked quietly.
"What if we're both too scared of the what-ifs to see what's actually possible?"
Joseph looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah saw years of loneliness and careful self-protection in his expression. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Relationships. I married Daniel's mother when we were too young for the wrong reasons. When she left, I told myself it was better to focus on raising Daniel alone than to risk bringing someone into his life who might leave again. I'm not her," Sarah said simply, "and this isn't that." "No," Joseph agreed. "It's not. But that almost makes it scarier, because this feels real in a way that nothing has for a very long time." They talked until late that night, carefully exploring feelings that had been building for months. Sarah shared her own fears, about crossing professional boundaries, about whether she truly belonged in this community, about whether her feelings were real or just a response to the intensity of her work here. Joseph talked about his concerns for Daniel, his worry that Sarah might eventually feel trapped by reservation life, his own struggle to believe that he deserved happiness after years of just surviving. By the time Joseph finally went home, they hadn't made any decisions, but they had acknowledged what Daniel had seen clearly, that somewhere along the way, they had stopped being just friends and started being something much more complicated and precious. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of careful courtship. Joseph began bringing Sarah small gifts, not the formal flowers or jewelry of conventional romance, but things that showed he was thinking of her. A perfectly shaped stone he found while working, a book of Modoc legends that had belonged to his grandmother, coffee from the good shop in Klamath Falls when he had to drive there for supplies. Sarah found herself looking forward to these gestures with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified her. She began cooking meals that were large enough to share, finding excuses to stop by Joseph's house with leftover soup or fresh bread. They started taking evening walks together after Daniel's homework was done, talking about everything and nothing while the winter landscape stretched endlessly around them. Daniel watched these developments with the satisfaction of someone whose plan was coming together. He had stopped asking direct questions about marriage, but he had begun making casual comments about future plans that included all three of them. "When we go camping this summer," he would say, "or after Sarah teaches you to make that pasta thing." The assumption in his voice that they would continue as a unit was both touching and nerve-wracking. The turning point came in late February, during a particularly harsh snowstorm that left the reservation without power for 3 days. Sarah's wood stove kept her house warm, but Joseph's heating system relied on electricity. When she invited them to stay with her until power was restored, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Those 3 days of close quarters, cooking together by lamplight, playing board games by the fire, sleeping in the same small house, gave them a glimpse of what their life could be like as a real family. Sarah woke each morning to the sound of Joseph making coffee and Daniel practicing his multiplication tables. She fell asleep each night to the reassuring sounds of their breathing in the next room. It felt like coming home in a way she had never experienced before. On the last night before power was restored, Daniel fell asleep on the couch between Sarah and Joseph while they read him stories by firelight. As they carried him to the guest room, working together with the unconscious coordination of parents, Sarah felt a wave of certainty wash over her. "I love this," she whispered to Joseph as they tucked Daniel in. "I love him. I love you. I love the life we're building together." Joseph's response was to kiss her finally after months of careful restraint. It was a kiss that tasted like promises and possibility, like the future they were both finally brave enough to reach for. The next morning, over breakfast cooked on the wood stove, while the power company worked to restore electricity, Daniel made his most direct appeal yet. "I've been thinking," he announced, cutting his pancakes with serious concentration. "Instead of waiting for you grown-ups to figure things out, maybe I should just ask properly." Sarah and Joseph exchanged glances, wondering what 8-year-old logic was about to be unveiled. Daniel set down his fork and looked directly at Sarah with an expression that was solemn and hopeful. In his hands he held the carved bow his father had made for him, offering it to her like a precious gift. "Sarah," he said with the gravity of someone making the most important speech of his life, "will you marry my father? Will you be my mom for real? Will you stay with us forever and help us be a proper family?" The question hung in the warm air of the kitchen, accompanied by the sound of snow beginning to melt from the roof outside. Sarah looked at this brave, beautiful child who had somehow found the courage to ask for what they all wanted, but had been too afraid to name directly. She looked at Joseph, seeing love and hope and terrified vulnerability in his face. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the lonely efficiency of her Portland life to this moment of perfect clarity in a small house heated by wood fire and warmed by love. "Yes," she said, accepting the carved bow with hands that trembled slightly. "Yes, I will marry your father. Yes, I will be your mom. Yes, I will stay with you forever." Daniel's whoop of joy could probably be heard 3 houses away. Joseph's smile was radiant and disbelieving, as if he couldn't quite trust that this happiness was real and allowed to be his. As they planned their future over the last of the storm day pancakes, Sarah realized that her greatest professional success had become her most profound personal joy. She had come to the reservation to help heal other families, never imagining that in the process, she would find her own family in the most unexpected and perfect way. Outside, spring was still months away, but inside their small house, surrounded by love and laughter and the promise of forever, Sarah felt the warm certainty of a season that would never end.